Hello and welcome back to the Science Behind That podcast. I am your host, Atticus Hamilton, and for all of you new listeners out there, the Science Behind That is a show where we take a deep dive into the obscure science of everyday life. Into the science of everything from physics to engineering, and biology to zoology, and psychology to anatomy, we take a deep dive. So without further ado, welcome to today's episode of the Science Behind That podcast. Hello all of you scientists out there, and welcome back to Season 1, Episode 7 of the Science Behind That podcast. Now, I am your host, Atticus Hamilton, and on today's episode, we are going to be discussing something that I think is really interesting, and it pertains directly to medicine. And so for all of you pre-meds like myself out there, I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did making it. Before we start, though, I would just like to say that I am sorry, ladies and gentlemen, for not posting an episode in 2.5 weeks. I had, as some of you may know, I am in college, and so the last, or I guess 1.5 weeks. The last 1.5 weeks I've been having a lot of exams, and I'm finally in a little clear zone, at least until next Friday. So the Monday and Friday episodes are going to resume. And one more thing before we get farther into this episode, I hope all of you will join me on October 31st at 7 a.m. or whenever you get up to listen to the very, very special Halloween episode of the Science Behind That. I'm really excited for that one. So far, it's been a lot of fun making it, and I'm really excited for you guys to hear that one. Word of warning too, and I'll remind you later on in the week, but a word of warning as well, that one will be a graphic episode, and I haven't had one of those yet in my podcast, but this one will be about, or the one on Halloween will be about some of the three most gruesome yet important medical experiments in human history. So I hope you're excited for that. I know I am. So without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. Grab yourself a cup of coffee and join us for Season 1, Episode 7 of The Science Behind That. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about something that, it affects a lot of people, especially when they first come up to high elevation, and that is altitude sickness. So personally, except for the large, 8 years of my life that I spent in Alaska, I was born at high elevation, and I lived at high elevation before Alaska, and now I'm living back at high elevation again, so I can't honestly remember the last time I was affected with altitude sickness, but a couple weeks ago I went on a hike up a 14,000 foot peak with a big group of people, and there was some guy there from Louisiana, and I felt so bad for him. He was huffing and puffing a lot more than everyone else was, and he was getting really nauseous, and that is what today's episode is going to be about. Altitude sickness, why we get it, why we experience it, what is going on at a biological or at an anatomical level, and of course, at a biochemical level, why we build up tolerance. So let us first just start with what is altitude sickness, and I know pretty much everyone already knows the answer. So altitude sickness, it's often called mountain sickness where I'm from, but it's a term to describe a condition that results in people who have not experienced high elevation before, that either hike up a mountain or immediately go from low elevation to high elevation, either, in a heli skiing or driving. And there are 3 different types of mountain sickness. There's mild mountain sickness, moderate mountain sickness, and of course severe mountain sickness. And then of course severe mountain sickness can be broken down into 2 more subtypes. One is called HAPE, or high altitude pulmonary edema, and the other one is called HACE, or high altitude cerebral edema. And those are both resulting symptoms in severe AMS, or acute mountain sickness. So, what is actually going on? Well, first off, high altitude is classified as 8,000 to 12,000 feet, so kind of where I live. I'm just slightly below that. Very high altitude is 12,000 to 18,000 feet. That's where all of our ski resorts are. And extremely high altitude is like Everest or Denali in Alaska, 18,000 plus feet. And so, basically, for mild acute mountain sickness, you'll experience a headache, fatigue, excessive breathing, but generally, those symptoms don't interfere with whatever activity you may be doing. Now, with the moderate form, the symptoms are obviously more severe. Along with the mild headache, it would be a severe headache. Nausea and vomiting are very common. And then severe is short of breath, even at rest, the requirement to immediately descend, and of course either pulmonary edema or cerebral edema in very severe cases. And for those of you who don't know, edema is just the leaking of fluid into a specific bodily compartment. So pulmonary edema is when fluid is leaking into the lungs, and cerebral edema is when it's leaking into the brain. So, now that we have a nice in-depth understanding of what altitude sickness is, let's discuss what causes it. So at sea level, your body is used to the sea level atmosphere and the sea level oxygen saturation. So at sea level, most often we see patients with around a 99% blood oxygen saturation. But the second you go between 12,000 and 15,000 feet, it can drop as low as 90%. And so, basically, altitude sickness is the result of your body trying to cope to the lower oxygen concentration in the atmosphere and the lower partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere, along with the lower air pressure. And when our bodies are stressed, we release various stress hormones. One of those stress hormones is called cortisol. And cortisol is a very common stress hormone. So there are a myriad of different hormones and chemicals that our body secretes to induce gastric irritation, or emesis, as we say in the medical world, or vomiting. And so a lot of those compounds can be the result of stress. And just like with anything within the endocrine system, cortisol will have a range of effects, and it's really easy for the brain to release one stress hormone that will then result in the release of another hormone or gastric irritation, and that's often what happens with altitude sickness. So basically, your body tries to cope to the rapid change in air pressure. And oftentimes, it doesn't really matter how athletic or fit you are. If you've never experienced high elevation before, the lack of, or the lower oxygen levels and the lower air pressure will be a shock to anyone. So that is basically what causes altitude sickness. And so we could talk about the pathology of altitude sickness for hours upon hours, but apparently it's harder than I thought to find specific pathological explanations of why we feel the way we do. But basically it just simmers down to altitude sickness is our cells trying to cope with lower oxygen in the atmosphere and lower atmospheric pressure. And so I guess that leads us into our last talking point for the morning, which is, well, Atticus, if that's true, why is it that my friend Timmy from, Montana can, climb a 14,000 foot mountain or an 18,000 foot mountain without feeling the slightest hint of a headache, and, I can't climb a 6,000 foot mountain? And, that's a very interesting question, and it gets down to two things, and we're going to be discussing one of those things today, and that is the main thing, which it gets down to a chemical called BPG, or 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Now, what is 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, you may ask? 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate is a molecule that binds to deoxygenated hemoglobin. And so, really quickly, we all know what hemoglobin is. Hemoglobin is the protein that gives blood its red color, and it is also the protein that transports oxygen throughout our body. There are two different types of hemoglobin, and I literally just took an exam on this, so I could talk about this for hours, but I'm not going to, I promise. I'm going to keep it short and sweet. But there are two types of hemoglobin. There is deoxygenated hemoglobin called tense hemoglobin, or T state, and there's oxygenated hemoglobin, or relaxed hemoglobin, called R state. Now, why is deoxygenated called T state and oxygenated called R state? It gets down to biochemistry, which, if you guys want to actually hear an in-depth episode, where we could go on for like 30 minutes about, please let me know. You can email me that, and I would love to do that. Rundown is, it's because of charges on the molecule. A really simple rundown. Anyway, BPG only binds to the tense state of hemoglobin, or the deoxygenated state. And for the rest of this, I'm just going to refer to hemoglobin without oxygen as T, and hemoglobin with oxygen as R, okay? So BPG can only bind to T. It cannot bind to R. And again, that gets down to charges on the molecule. And so what does that mean? Well, 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, when we all have it in our blood because it is important. It's a natural product of glycolysis, right? But when you have high concentrations of it, the higher concentrations you have of it, the more shift you see from the R state, or the oxygenated hemoglobin, to the deoxygenated hemoglobin, or the T state. So that boils down to, if there's more BPG in your blood, then there's more deoxygenated hemoglobin. There's more T state. And so here's where things get interesting. In people who have a high tolerancy of or to altitude, we see that they have around 8 millimoles of a concentration of 8 millimoles of BPG within their blood, and I believe it's 8 millimoles per liter. I'm not certain on that. If I'm wrong, chemistry people, feel free to correct me. But they have around 8. And normal people who would get altitude sickness, have around 5 millimoles concentration of BPG. So the natural progression of this then is the question, well, given that, Atticus, why would having a compound in your blood that induces more deoxygenated hemoglobin help with a sickness that is as a result of lower oxygen? And that is a very good question. The answer to that question is as follows. When you have a patient and they have a high amount of BPG in their blood and consequently a high amount of T-state hemoglobin, what happens is the body wants to account for that. Okay? The body wants to account for that. And it's almost like the opponent process theory of addiction, which I might get into on Monday. But the body wants to compensate for that. So as a result, when you have more deoxygenated hemoglobin, your body will begin to release more oxygen. And then everything will shift back to oxygenated hemoglobin. And that's why. So people who can climb Everest and don't feel nauseous, or people who live at 18,000 feet or 15,000 feet or whatnot, the reason they don't get sick is because they have higher BPG. And their body is constantly shifting between oxygenated and deoxygenated, and consequently, their cells do not react the same way to lower oxygen levels that are the cells of individuals who do not have that altitude tolerancy do. And that is it. That is why. So, the next time, for all of you mountain people out there, you go on a hike with your friend from Louisiana and he's huffing and puffing, all you have to do is say, hey, I've got more BPG than you. And then run to the top. I'm just kidding. That's kind of mean. Don't do that. I don't know. Or do. I would do that. I think it's funny. Anyway, if you liked today's episode, please let me know. And if you have any suggestions for a next episode, or if you want to hear more about the biochemistry of 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, or anything for that matter, send me an email at thesciencebt@gmail.com. So thank you guys for listening to this extra long episode today. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good Monday or a good Friday morning, everybody, and whatever you do on Friday morning, and I will see you all later. Remember, stand up and question everything.